I'm Jane Alexander, Nantucket Book Festival alumna, welcoming you to At Home with Authors.
On this episode of At Home with Authors, David Wallace-Wells begins The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming with these words. It is worse, much worse than you think. The slowness of climate change, he writes, is a fairy tale, perhaps as pernicious as the one that says it isn't happening at all. Before we get the global picture from Wallace-Wells, we want to spend a few minutes getting hyper-local by tapping one of Nantucket's great natural resources, the team at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, our island's 275-acre outdoor classroom for environmental education and research. Linda Loring's executive director is Kitty Pockman.
Climate change, climate resiliency is a piece of the research that we do at the foundation. Sarah does phenology research. When she was hired in 2014, she launched a robust project that has been continuing to collect data since then. And that contributes to a national database and the knowledge that we have about climate change and the impact.
So Katie mentioned the phenology research, and that's us looking at the timing of some of our common native plants on the island. And when I say the timing, it's like when the leaves bud out in the spring, when the flowers bloom and are available for pollinators, when the fruit sets, that kind of thing. And those are all, connected to different environmental variables. And the plants that we're studying are mostly connected to temperature, the timing event. So looking at by working at a nature center, we can build this robust data set over time of are things happening earlier, are things happening later, and are the timing of these events happening in the same way for same species. Some of the big worries about plants changing their timing in relation to temperature are how it affects like kind of a cascade of events. So pollinators that show up at a certain time, if the flower has already bloomed, then that pollinator won't get the nectar it needs, but then also the plants aren't pollinated. And so that's kind of the worry that one species that is reliant on another, they're not going to be synchronous anymore. The same is true for one of the species we observe is a caterpillar, the eastern tent caterpillar. And, it feeds almost exclusively on black cherry, for example. And so the worry is, or maybe not the worry, but one of the thoughts is that if species that are reliant on feeding on a certain species, if their timing is off, then it could have, bigger population effects. And people may say, well, what's one caterpillar? If that caterpillar blips out, then who cares? But that caterpillar is food for a number of bird species. The frass or the caterpillar poop is a fertilizer for a lot of the plants that it lives on. So there's other cascading effects that we can't even anticipate. And so that's some of the reason I'm interested in David's work, is because you kind of start to think of those bigger picture cascading effects.
We'll circle back with the Linda Loring team at the end of this episode to ask the following.
Having read David Wallace-Wells, the work you do, what gives you hope?
First, At Home with Authors presents David Wallace-Wells.
I'm a magazine journalist, general interest focused, but particularly curious about science in the near future and sort of keep an eye on the news from the academy and new scientific papers. And beginning in 2016, I started seeing a lot more work about climate, and the work that I was seeing was a lot scarier than what I had sort of processed or perceived through the writing of colleagues and competitors at other magazines and newspapers or on television news. And as I started getting deeper and deeper into that research, it felt very much to me to be a bigger, darker, bleaker story, but also larger, more dramatic, and in certain ways invigorating. And my continued work was a way for me to try to keep on top of the news and piece all of the particular small bits of information together into a big picture. But it was also a way of processing my anxiety, the anxiety that even I, approaching it from, as I say, kind of sociopathic perspective, was feeling, as anybody would, contemplating just how scary these things could get. And I think that that path is available to all of us, not just those of us who write or who do storytelling of other kinds, that we can alleviate the anxiety and the sense of feeling overwhelmed we may have in contemplating a really bleak climate future by processing those feelings and channeling them towards action of one kind or another. In my case, it was towards writing, but for others, it could be for political activism or counseling, or who knows. There are literally thousands of ways that you could choose to respond, and all of them will probably make you feel a little bit better about what's coming. How I feel about the big picture is, I think by any conventional perspective, quite bleak. I think that we will inevitably reach about 2 degrees Celsius of warming, which is a level that scientists of the world call catastrophic. Island nations of the world call it genocide. It would mean 150 million people would die of air pollution, which is the equivalent of 25 Holocausts. It would mean that areas of the world that are today home to 1.5 billion people would become literally uninhabitable. It would mean that perhaps we'd have 50% more war than we have today, that storms that today hit once every century would be hitting every year.
Those two facts put together, that, 1.5 billion people will be living in parts of the earth that, or will no longer have habitable areas to live in, that perfectly flows into the idea of 50% more wars, because even people with a basic education know that competition for resources often is one of the causes of war. And so just this, the shrinking of the resources is just almost unfathomable, but you helped us.
On top of that, human migration is a challenge. We're seeing now the ways that movements of people can really destabilize even what had seemed quite stable and quite progressive political environments. But I think we will find ways to survive and endure those conditions. I don't think we're looking at anything like human extinction or anything approaching that. The question is, how will we adapt? How will we respond? What engineering feats will we imagine, and what political choices will we make going forward in a world defined, as you say, by scarcity, also by competition, but also more intense threats from the natural world, more regular droughts and famines. We have the capacity to respond and adapt to those challenges, but just because we have that capacity doesn't mean that we will respond to them in a kind of politically optimal way. And I think actually the likelier path is something much scarier, in which in some places, to some degree, we respond with human empathy and compassion and extend concern and care for those most in need. But in a lot of other ways, we'll find methods that allow us to turn away from those most in need and focus on our own small lives, even if they be relatively comfortable and relatively protected. And that, I think, is both the likeliest future and a quite scary, ugly one to contemplate. That is not that our children are going to be living in a burned over apocalypse that looks like a doomsday movie, but that the world will have changed such that the kinds of promises that we used to extend, at least to our families and those around us, and to some degree to everyone around the world, that over time prosperity would grow, justice would grow, equitability would grow, that these kinds of promises will be much, much harder to sustain. And to the extent that we will sustain them, it will only be in quite narrow corners of the already prosperous world. That is the sort of big picture. And on that front, and the question of optimism and pessimism, which is what you really asked about a few minutes ago, sorry to be so long-winded, I think you can look at that outcome from both perspectives and say, given where we are today and given what the world looked like as recently as a few decades ago, the climate outcome is horrifying. It means defining human flourishing downward somewhat dramatically for a growing mass of people around the planet, and probably means people like you and me learning to care even less about the suffering of people living elsewhere around the world if we hope to enjoy ourselves in our own lives. That is really ugly. On the other hand, if we manage to stay at 2 degrees, first of all, that will be an enormous achievement against a baseline of where we're headed, which is considerably worse than that. And we can also develop along the way political and social and technological solutions that allow us to live in those conditions that I described a few minutes ago that seem completely horrific to us today, at least somewhat more comfortably. So we can, we could theoretically adapt much more open immigration policies to allow those who need to move more comfortably. We could deploy large-scale infrastructure projects to protect people living in especially vulnerable places. We could focus on public health issues where climate change is raising them most dramatically. Now, I don't have confidence that we will have a utopian response, especially on each of those fronts, and there are many others that I don't mention. I think our response will be limited and in certain ways narcissistic. I think it'll be, an indictment. We will continue to see behavior from the world's richest that amounts to a moral indictment of ourselves. Nevertheless, I think it's often useful not to think just in terms of what a best case outcome is, but also in terms of what a worst case outcome is. And I think probably we're going to avoid both of those extremes, which is, depending on what your temperament is, both a reason for some optimism and even celebration, and also a cause for some great despair and horror. And unfortunately, I think that's probably how you should look at the experience of human life on the planet to begin with. So climate change in that sense is going to be ushering in a new act of an already familiar story in which humans can be both quite generous to one another and quite cruel and brutal.
Take one of your chapters of your narrow lines of inquiry. Tell us what you learned. You started by noticing, as you said, articles in the journals, in sort of a wave of stories that made you aware of something as an educated journalist you hadn't been aware of just a couple of years ago. So just take a narrow slice of your book, tell us what your process of inquiry led to, and how we can now shrink the change in that one area.
Well, let me start just by giving a slightly broader view, and then I'll zoom in, because I think it's important. We learned for a generation about climate change in terms of Arctic melt and sea level rise. And that allowed us to think that if we lived anywhere but the coast, we were going to be safe. And even if we lived on the coast, we knew this would take really centuries to happen. And so we had time to move. The more I learned about all of the different aspects of the climate threat, the more I started to see that this is truly an all-encompassing story. All of us live within it. It sounds naive to say, but we all live inside nature. We don't live outside of it. I live in New York City. I was raised to believe that I live outside of nature. I don't live outside of nature, especially when you consider the economic impacts, the impacts on agriculture, the impacts on cognitive performance, on mental health. All of these things are quite dramatic. Every aspect of modern life you could imagine has some climate effect. And as we make disturb the climate further and make it less hospitable to us, every aspect of modern life will suffer. One aspect I think has really gotten not nearly enough attention and is incredibly useful from an advocacy point of view, which is why I think it's worth focusing on here, is public health. Now, we're living through a public health crisis today. And I think like COVID-19, climate change also does teach us that, again, we live within nature. We cannot get outside it or defend ourselves against it, no matter how advanced we are. It also teaches us that it's best to take action early against threats to minimize the scale of that threat rather than waiting for the problem to develop. There are a lot of pieces of the public health puzzle when it comes to climate change that I walk through in the book. There are diseases coming out of the melting Arctic that haven't been seen by human immune systems ever. We have mosquitoes that are expected to fly as far north as the Arctic Circle that used to only carry tropical diseases like malaria and dengue around the equatorial band of the planet, but we'll be bringing them to New York and Stockholm relatively soon. And there are issues like coronavirus, which isn't exactly a climate plague, but we will likely see more things like it in the future as we continue to destabilize our ecosystems and bring humans into more and more contact with animal life and bacterial life. But the biggest piece of the public health problem is just air pollution. Air pollution is not exactly a result of climate change, but is produced by the same thing that produces climate change, which is to say the burning of fossil fuels. And according to the Lancet, which is the top pedigreed scientific journal in Britain, air pollution is killing 9 million people every single year. There are hundreds of millions more who are suffering from health impacts because of that particulate pollution. And in the same way that climate change affects every aspect of modern life, particulate pollution affects every aspect of individual health. So it affects coronary disease, pulmonary disease. It affects cancers of all kinds. It affects rates of schizophrenia and autism and ADHD. It changes the rates of premature birth and low birth weight. It changes cognitive performance. It affects the lifetime earnings potential of a child who's born into a polluted area. Absolutely every aspect of physical and mental well-being that you could possibly imagine is made worse by air pollution. And that means a couple of things that are really critical. The first is that we get an enormous health benefit if we cut out fossil fuels. That alone is incredibly exciting and worth celebrating. That the green energy revolution that we're living through now, it's not moving fast enough, but it's still moving astonishingly fast. That is not just good news because it eliminates future carbon emissions. It's also incredibly good news because it makes the lives of people who live around fossil fuel plants much, much, much better. And as is the case all around the world, those people are disproportionately marginalized, people of color, the poor. It is not the well-off who are suffering in this way. It is those who have the least capacity to withstand any kind of assault, let alone an environmental one. But it also is incredibly important because it breaks the logic of, it breaks the gridlock about climate action that has really been a problem for a generation. And what I mean by that is, if you think about the problem of climate change and decarbonization at a global level, which you must, it is a global problem, then the ability of any individual nation, even as prolific a polluter as the US or China, to meaningfully change the trajectory of the world's emissions is incredibly limited. China accounts for about 1/4 of all global emissions, the US about 1/7. Even if those countries got all the way to zero tomorrow, if all the other countries in the world didn't do anything, the big picture would not change all that much. And it's even more dramatic for smaller countries. Australia, Finland, Norway, Costa Rica. These are countries that are, practically speaking, insignificant to the big picture. And yet we need all of them to move quickly if we have a hope of getting the planet to a zero carbon future. So there's been this real problem politically where the benefits of decarbonization are distributed globally, but the costs of it are concentrated locally. So the governor of California can be quite excited about all the new air pollution and exhaust, car exhaust regulations that they've put into place. The benefits of that are global. The costs of that are carried by Californians. And that logic is politically really difficult. When you look at the problem from the public health perspective, it's actually the reverse. All of the benefits are local, and that means that you can do everything that you need to do. You can justify that action locally. The benefits of decarbonizing a power plant in Los Angeles are concentrated in Los Angeles. The benefits of decarbonizing a power plant in Louisiana are concentrated in Louisiana. You don't even have to look at the national level, although nationally it's even more dramatic. And the benefits are enormous. There was a small-scale study in Chicago recently looking at just the impact of 2 electric buses added to the Chicago bus fleet, just 2 buses. And the benefit to the city's public health expenditure in the first year that those buses were working was $100,000. Now, that's not an enormous amount when it comes to the city budget, but it was the result of just 2 buses being deployed, which means in a single year, those buses basically paid for themselves just through the public health benefit. And I think we can extend that logic in making the case more broadly, that all of us will live much healthier, happier, and indeed more prosperous lives if we have less pollution in them. And in fact, when you look at the polling, this is the most popular way of talking about environmental concerns. It's not about attacking the fossil fuel companies. It's not about electrifying our car fleet. It's not about green jobs or a sustainable future, although all of those things are popular in the sense of commanding more than a majority support. But by far the most popular is talking about clean air and clean water, which just about every person, not just in America, but all around the world, really truly values. And the really exciting thing about embracing the public health logic there is that you don't have to talk about it even in terms of costs and benefits, as excited as the public is about those benefits, because practically speaking, the costs are negative. They pay for themselves so quickly that it doesn't even amount to an investment. It's simply an unfurling of benefits which we can all enjoy.
That is sort of a perfect transition towards Nantucket, which is, people who live on Nantucket either year round or visit it, you are immersed in an incredible ecosystem on Nantucket. And in fact, that brings me to the people who were initially sponsoring your visit to Nantucket, the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, where they have a really great scientific team there, looking at the smallest signals of, is our ecosystem getting better or worse locally? Does that connect in some way to the bigger picture, which it often does? So I guess I'd love to get David Wallace-Wells' eyes now, given the fact that you really do have that sensitivity to the global, to the hyperlocal, to this idea of air quality, which resonates with every single one of us. Have you been to Nantucket before?
Yeah, no, I am. I've been going there my whole life. My grandfather bought a house there, I think in 1964, which I went to, just about every summer. And then my family, my father and my mother bought a house there about 10 years ago, which now my father's passed away. So we still use quite regularly. So it's not just a place I've been, but it's a quite special place.
What does David Wallace-Wells see when he goes to Nantucket because of your work on the Uninhabitable Earth that we really should notice and we may not be noticing?
Well, the first thing I would say is that, anybody who spent any time over years on Nantucket knows the island itself is changing shape. That parts of it are disappearing into the sea. And, even looking at maps dating back to the 19th century and earlier, there used to be a land bridge to Tuckernuck that's no longer there. These are all...
By the way, I want to interrupt and just say for those watching, this is nervous laughter. This is not joyful laughter.
Well, on some level it is, it does counsel a kind of, a Zen perspective on some of these changes. And it may be helpful to not try to resist all transformation of the physical landscape that is being brought about by climate change, but other, some related, some unrelated natural phenomena. We do live on a changing living planet, and there will be always changes afoot. Climate change is accelerating a lot of them, making things a lot worse, but it is probably worth sort of, at first, recentering your perspective and understanding that what it means to be alive on this planet under any circumstances, in any age, is in part to be adapting to and responding to these changes. We've learned over many millennia how to adapt to some amount of those changes, mostly which happen very slowly. Climate changes meaning that they're going to happen much more dramatically, much more quickly, and many more of them at once, which is really ultimately what the biggest challenge is, the concatenation of impacts. On the island itself, aside from the lesson of the basic fragility of human construction, human civilization. I think the biggest lesson is about, the what is coming in terms of sea level rise. And I think that is quite concerning for not just Nantucket, but coastal areas the world over. I think if you look at the maps, you can see median sea level projections for the second half of the century, practically speaking, submerge almost all of Nantucket town, although much of the rest of the island is high enough that it won't be submerged by that sea level rise. But beyond that, I think that sea level rise is a misleading or projected sea level rise is often a misleading way of thinking about even the changes with regard to coastal areas, because the biggest threat comes not from the quite gradual and frankly quite slow rise in sea levels. It comes from the storm surges that arrive when that additional, on top of that additional sea level. And we're likely to see many, first of all, more intense hurricanes going forward. And because of the additional sea level, we're likely to see them be much more damaging in terms of flooding.
So I do have to say right there, and I think this is going to encourage you, and I don't know how closely you follow the journalism on Nantucket, but there are a number of foundations, including Lyndall Loring. There is a real initiative now, and it's been on the front page of our Nantucket Enquirer and Mirror series last summer on rising seas. And there are organizations on Nantucket who are facing it head on. And again, this idea from Samantha Power and you and many others, imagine the worst, face it head on. When you do face it head on, it actually feels empowering. And when I saw that series, much of which was written by a great local journalist in Nantucket, John Stanton, which laid out all the visuals and all the, connecting all the dots of what we on Nantucket have to be concerned with. And so many coastal people, it's like, oh, okay, people are facing it. They're not hiding it. It's coming to the surface, and therefore we can deal with it to the greatest extent possible, and perhaps have some of that attitude that you spoke about, that more Zen-like attitude of things are going to be changing, and maybe quickly, and some of it we're just not going to be able to control.
I think, I remember that series well. I think there's been a lot of great journalism, frankly, all around the country and the world over the last few years. I think the storytelling has evolved quite quickly to be much more sophisticated about climate change than was the case just a few years ago. But I think there's also, the case of Nantucket illustrates some sort of real challenges that we face going forward, which is to say, if you think that the full extent of the sea level rise problem is protecting Nantucket Harbor, then of course we have the capacity to do that. We have the capacity in Nantucket as a wealthy community. We have the capacity in the United States as a wealthy country to even protect New York City. They're talking about building a seawall to protect all of New York City, or Miami Beach. But if you think that this is a global problem in which the amount of sea level rise that will be kicked off this century by just 2 degrees of warming is enough to raise sea levels by 250 feet, which is enough to drown 2/3 of the world's major cities, that is an engineering and infrastructure problem beyond anything that humanity has ever conceived. And, there will have to be some quite sophisticated, quite ambitious responses that we undertake if we have a hope of securing anything like the communities that live in low-lying areas and on the coasts all around the world today. Because it's one thing to protect the real estate of Lower Manhattan. It's another to protect the low-lying river deltas of Bangladesh. Literally in a dollars and cents way, there's less value there to protect. But if we don't protect it, we will be losing not just whole communities, but in a certain way, whole civilizations. That is the scale of change just promised by sea level rise. And sea level rise will take many centuries to unfold, so those people will have a chance to move. But if 150 years from now, half of Bangladesh is literally uninhabitable, that will mean the end of a whole civilization. And Bangladesh is not alone in facing that kind of existential drama. It's why the island nations of the world call 2 degrees of warming genocidal, because many of them simply won't be able to continue living where they live under those conditions. Now, Nantucket is an outlier in a number of ways. It also is a vivid example of how you can deploy some number of natural solutions to help combat some of these forces. But the revelation for me, as a New Yorker, was not so much about just how dramatically the natural disasters would intensify, not how much more dramatic sea level rise could be. It was that everything about my life, even those things which felt completely outside of the realm of nature, were nevertheless subject to it. So for instance, economists believe that if global warming continues unchecked and we get to 4 degrees of warming, we could have a global GDP that is 30% smaller than it would be without climate change. That's an impact that's twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would effectively be permanent. And because of the nature of the globalized world that we live in, none of us, even living in wealthy places like New York or Nantucket, would be quarantined from that economic suffering.
So this idea of empathy, can we sustain a sufficient amount of empathy in a degrading environment and climate is fascinating to me. And where did you come up with that connection?
Well, it's a longstanding thread in climate of concern among climate activists, environmental justice, but I think for a long time I labored under the illusion, like a lot of people did and do, that waking the world up to the threat of climate change would result in reliably progressive action about the threat, and that the real challenge was educating. I've come to believe, even since I wrote the book, that that is a problematic assumption, to say the least. I think I read about this a bit in the book, but if you were to imagine what a world defined by extreme climate change would look like politically, you imagine a world in which there are growing perceptions of resource scarcity, which produce a growing zero-sum perspective on international and even local competition. You would imagine something like a growing tide of populist nationalism that defined itself as securing the well-being of those people within its borders as against the needs of those living elsewhere. And while, obviously this is a political dynamic that we're watching unfold today already, and while I'm not personally ready to say, Donald Trump is the creation of dramatic climate change, or for that matter, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil or Scott Morrison in Australia, whose politics are quite similar to Trump's on this point, I don't think it's entirely coincidence either. The migration crisis from Central America, which gave a lot of power to Trump's rise in 2015 and 2016, was climate related. The European populism that swept across Europe over the last few years is a result of the Syrian civil war, which was climate related. There were other causes too, but it was climate related, and produced only 1 million refugees who went into Europe, and has completely transformed the politics of that entire continent. The UN says that by 2050, climate change will likely produce at least 200 million climate refugees, 200 times the number that have totally transformed European politics. And they say it could be as high as 1 billion. Now, again, I don't want to say that any of the leaders we have today who are sort of populist nationalists, none of whom I would say are, with the possible exception of Bolsonaro, exactly climate deniers so much as simply climate skeptics who want to respond to the world and secure advantage for their own people. I don't think these people are the creations of climate change, but I don't think it should at all surprise us if we see more of them going forward, with politics continuing to move in that direction. Now, as I said, I wrote about some of these dynamics in my book, but one of the scarier things for me to contemplate really was driven home to me in a reporting trip I took a few months afterward, which was not about a kind of reactionary response to climate change of the kind I'm describing. It's how much even people who consider themselves conscious and concerned and progressive on these issues, how much they are able to normalize and turn away from in order to focus on their own creature comforts. And that happened for me when I was reporting on California fires, which I did in the spring of 2019. So 2018 had been this unprecedented year for California wildfires. And in my trip, I actually spoke to Eric Garcetti, who's the mayor of LA. The year he was born, 60,000 acres burned in California. The year he was elected mayor in 2013, it was 600,000, so a tenfold increase. The year he was reelected in 2017, it was 1.2 million, so a doubling in just 4 years. And then last year, 2018, it was 1.8 million, so it was a 50% increase year over year. And I spoke to
by the way, that is such a perspective changer. I didn't see your article on that. How did you come about using that as a device to show how quickly things accelerated? When I was interviewing him, I looked at his biography and I had the wildfire data in another tab, and I just found it sort of an incredible contrast. But talking to him was eye-opening. He said to me, we're never going to be able to beat these fires, which is true. CAL FIRE has never stopped a fire powered by Santa Ana winds. This is a fire department that has a $3.2 billion annual budget. And they have never once in their history been able to stop a fire powered by Santa Ana winds. All they can do is try to protect along the margins of that fire until the winds change. He said the only thing that's going to stop these fires is when, probably long after we're gone, he says, the natural world falls back into a more stable state. Now, this is a elected public official in charge of the health and well-being of, 15 million people. And he's saying, practically speaking, there's nothing we can do to defeat this threat. But his perspective actually wasn't the most eye-opening in that reporting trip. The most eye-opening was all of the everyday homeowners who I spoke with, for whom I just saw very quickly their psychological eagerness to define the last few years of completely exceptional fire as being normal, and to continue to live in areas that are now, by any outsider's perspective, incredibly dangerous. Half of all Californians now live in areas that are defined as extremely high wildfire risk, half of the entire state. I met a woman in Malibu who lived there long enough to live through 9 fires. And I said to her, how can you look out at this landscape, as beautiful as it is, as precious as it is, Malibu, and think that you can continue to live here when you've seen 9 fires through your community? And she said, you're from New York, right? And I said, yeah. And she said, you guys had Sandy, right? And I said, you got a point. The ability, the capacity that we have to normalize more and more intense impacts of all kinds, I think is really a corrosive, tragic, and horrifying aspect of our psychology and our culture. I don't want to let this opportunity pass. Whenever we speak with any author, we're always interested to hear, what books are you reading? What books are influencing you? And I'm still looking at that bouncy seat behind you, and your 2-year-old daughter is not, it's a daughter, right? Mm-hmm. Your 2-year-old daughter is not of reading age yet, although you might already, you let me know, be getting her familiar with language. Are there some books that you can't wait to read to your daughter?
Well, the honest answer to that question is that they're not climate books. They're just the books that I loved myself as a kid.
Which ones?
But
Well, first tell me which books you loved as a kid. I'm just curious.
Well, at various ages, various ones. So let me think about, one of her favorites actually right now, it was one of my favorites, which is The Snowy Day by Ezra Jack Keats. I found, the Lorax, the Dr. Seuss book, quite terrifying and moving. I actually really liked all of Dr. Seuss growing up. As I got older, the books that I loved the most got a little, a little off the beaten track. I love an author named Daniel Pinkwater when I was young. So I liked Gordon Corman, were some of my favorites. But when I think about, people ask me a lot what kind of lessons I want to impart to my daughter about climate, because I think a lot of people have a lot of anxieties about, first of all, bringing children into this world, and then trying to make them, mindful of the challenges and motivated and mobilized to make a difference, to make their own futures healthier, happier, more prosperous, and more equitable. And I always answer that question by saying the lessons that I want to impart to Raka are not narrowly climate ones. They are primarily about empathy and defining the experience of people living elsewhere around the world, even if they look quite different and live quite differently, as, if not exactly equal to the importance of your immediate family, then at least in the ballpark of the same importance. Because I think ultimately, as we were talking about before, the greatest challenge won't be the climate impacts themselves. It won't even be the kind of engineering feats that we need to undertake to protect ourselves in wealthy parts of the world. It's the political and moral challenge of defining our goal collectively as a species and making sure that we're doing everything we can to protect all of us alive on this one planet, which is the only planet that any of us will ever call home. I think that is a test that we have mostly failed in the history of our species, but climate change is a deadline for a better humanity, which I don't think we can afford to miss.
Having read David Wallace-Wells, the work you do, what gives you hope?
For me, there's really two major pieces of the puzzle. One is the fact that humans are a remarkably resilient species, and that there's always going to be people out there that look at what David Wallace-Wells was saying in The Uninhabitable Earth and say, so what? We know that there's massive, potentially devastating consequences facing us. That just is kind of the rules of the game that we're working with. But how do we work creatively within the setting or the hand that we've been dealt to, on a local perspective or regional perspective, to adapt and mitigate these circumstances so that we can deal with what is coming, but create a better future at the same time. And then the second thing is, as an educator, and especially somebody who works on a small island like Nantucket, is that people have a sense of really kind of connecting to their local environment and wanting to protect it. So even if we necessarily can't do anything on a global perspective right now, we can still work to appreciate the nature that we do have here and think about how are we going to come together as a community to make sure that we're protecting that for the future while preventing any catastrophic loss to the resources that we do have.
I think what gives me hope is the innate goodness of people. And I think that in many cases, in many ways, the pandemic is an example of that there are people around the world who care. And that one of the things you mentioned, David, that has always made me think about it differently, I guess, is the interconnectedness of everything. Just because Nantucket is an island, 30 miles offshore, doesn't mean that what happens here doesn't have impacts, regionally. And you start to see this and understand it a lot more when you think about climate change. You can't silo climate change into one area. And the more we understand the interconnectedness as humans, that gives me hope.